Richard Mosse seeks to photograph the unphotographable and make it unforgettable, the unseen, the invisible, and the hidden beauty of tragedies revealed and explored and questioned right before our eyes. His solo exhibit titled Incoming, documenting the refugee and migration crisis, is currently on view at both the National Gallery of Art and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Please welcome Richard Mosse.
Hey, Jesus. Right. I hope you all had a good night. Thank you very much for having me. And Vince and Beatty is brilliant. And what's your name again? Beautiful, beautiful. Shit, I missed that slide. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two bodies of work, actually three. The first is the one sort of recently on show across the States. And there are two elements to it. It's still photographs and a immersive video installation. So the video is called Incoming, and the still photos, I've called them heat maps. And this body of work regards the refugee crisis facing Europe. And to do this, I've chosen to examine this medium here, which is a type of camera. It's designed by a multinational weapons company based all across Europe and the world. And so this camera is part of, I suppose, it's not really for professional storytellers or even consumers or anyone except the military and the police forces. And so it's sold to governments. It's designed, its primary purpose was for battlefield situational awareness, insurgent detection, targeting, and tracking, as well as search and rescue. So I see the camera as part of what I understand as the military humanitarian complex, which is Europe's response to the refugee crisis. Instead of, I suppose, welcoming the refugees who land on our shores, within the sort of asylum systems that we've ratified after the Second World War, we've chosen a kind of fortress Europe mentality. And so the camera, as I understand it, is one aspect of that. It's a technology we have chosen, our societies have chosen to prevent these people from landing on our shores safely. So for me, it was a way of meditating on the refugee crisis in a very peculiar way, in a very specific way. So according to the manufacturer's tests, the camera can image human body heat from 30.3 kilometers or 18 miles, day or night. So it's extremely powerful to the point of being rather sinister, in my opinion. To make the heat maps, so you have to understand that the angle of view of the camera is almost telescopic. So it's very hard to obviously take a landscape photograph. So to do so, and I wanted to make, I suppose, portraits of the architecture and the camp architecture, the refugee camp architecture, to map them. The perimeter fences, the containers, the tents, the portaloos, the sentry huts, the barbed wire. To do that, I took points of elevation. Sometimes, obviously, just hills or tall buildings. But when I couldn't find hills, I would hire a scissor lift like this. And so there's the camera there, mounted on a robotic motion control tripod, big enough to lift it. And so in doing so, I was able to construct a kind of composited thermal panorama. Here we have 16 images. However, each heat map were composite of at least 400 images, sometimes more like 1,000. And so it's a specific, strange thing. This is a heat map in Greece, actually, and there's a time lapse showing how the camera runs through the motion. So every 3 seconds, it stops on an X and Y axis to dissipate the vibration, and then it moves again. And so then I pull. It's a durational photograph in a way. This one took about half an hour. Some of them take more like an hour. And I pull the individual frame out of the video file and composite it to create an overall panoramic image such as this by layering them in Photoshop like that. And so the extraordinary thing that happens, at least surprise that I felt when making the work, was this sense that the images somehow, they don't adhere to the rules of linear perspective, which are the rules of visual art that we've lived by for hundreds of years. Each of these cells, if you call them that, has its own discrete vanishing point. And so when you cobble them together in Photoshop, you create a very strange kind of view of the land that, in my opinion, is closer to late medieval painting. And I found that extremely interesting because it was a happy accident. So those cells were cobbled together to create this kind of a thing, which you really don't see. You don't see an image like that normally. It's closer to a map on some level. And this image has plenty of details within it. You can see all the aspects of life, the squalor of the camp, the horrible conditions. This is Moria in Lesbos in Greece. It's a shameful place, as any European who goes there must feel ashamed on some level for the poor conditions. It very closely resembles a concentration camp on some level. The architecture seemingly deliberately, willfully built in that way. But I suppose what I'm going back to say is that it has bears this strange resemblance to a kind of depiction of the lived environment from the late medieval period, such as the Nuremberg Chronicle. And that's to do with a kind of depiction of space. If you notice, this is Giovanni di Paolo, if you notice how the land is depicted in the far distance, it seems to me to resemble a little bit how the heat maps portray the world. Here's another Di Paolo image of St. John the Baptist. And this is very interesting because you have the depiction of continuous narrative in the same image plane, in the same frame, which is something we wouldn't ever think of doing at the moment. But back in those days, it was fine to put St. John leaving the city gates and then St. John entering the mountains in the same image. And in the heat maps, there's this weird repetition of individuals. Here's the fella in a hoodie. And what's happened here is that the camera has moved, and he's moved, and then the camera's moved, and he's moved into the next frame. And there's this repetition of him in the image. And there's plenty of these strange glitches in the heat maps that I've really embraced and enjoyed. And the reason I kept them in, we could have easily gotten rid of them, was to me they're an expression of the sort of limbo state of the refugee. You know, these are people who live for months, sometimes years, in camps, often in camps, unable to work, unable to move in the same way that we can move around the world. And on some level, it's worse than being in prison, you know, because a prisoner knows, okay, I got another 3 years in here, you know. They know when they're getting out, but the refugee doesn't. They wake up every day. They don't know when their asylum case will be seen to, when the decision comes. They don't know if they're going to be deported back to a place of possible risk to them. So it's not a particularly enjoyable experience, especially given they've escaped from one land, entered another. They've kind of displaced between two places. They're neither. In neither space, obviously. This is Idomeni camp in northern Greece. And you can see how the camera has, there's actually some strange artifacts here where the reflections don't resemble what's actually going on with those four men there. And how the fire in front of that tent is beyond the calibration of the thermal camera. So the camera sees heat. And it reads a heat signature of relative temperature difference. So there's I think it's about 40 or 50 degree wavelength in which you can calibrate the camera to read. And if there's anything outside of that, it distorts and it struggles to represent. So I've cobbled these images, there's 28 images into this book published by MAC, with text by Judith Butler, Paul Santamore, and a poem by Behrooz Bouchani, who's recently been released from Manus Island off Australia. So the other thing we made is an immersive video installation, a 3-screen video with 7.3 surround sound. It's 52 minutes long, and it's currently, if anyone wishes to see it, it's currently showing in the National Gallery of Art until March, also in SF MoMA, and in ICA Boston, and in the Farrar-Scu Foundation in New York, in Greenpoint. And it will soon open in Minneapolis Institute of Art and the Counter Art Center in Stanford. And to make this film, I worked with my long-term collaborators, Trevor Tweeton on the left, and Ben Frost on the right. And we're good friends. We've been working together about a decade now. And there's the camera on the left there. This is in the jungle refugee camp in Calais. And Trevor has shimmed it up for a Steadicam, which is kind of crazy. Yeah, he's a man of great virtuosity. I could barely lift that thing, you know. But such a camera is about 25 kilos, about 50 pounds, and then you have all the peripherals, the battery bricks, and the cables, and the media recorders, and the user interface laptop tablets, and before you know it, like the camera itself is weighing 80 pounds, and then the Steadicam is another 80, and that must be about 150 pounds that he's lifting there. This is how it kind of looks in the field. Very conspicuous. So normally, I'd be following along behind him, trying to look at the screen there, operating the focus and zoom using an Xbox controller. So we made a strange pairing. Oh God, there's nothing on my screen. In any case, it produced a very strange way of seeing the world, which makes kind of very, very clear our biological processes, the sweat on our bodies, the respiration that we need to survive, but also the blood circulation beneath our skin, and it sort of represents us in a way that's very unfamiliar. So there's a defamiliarizing effect, which I was hoping we could use to not only meditate on the apparatus that our society has chosen to keep these people out, and as a meditation on immigration policy in Europe, but also to refresh and renew these narratives, which by and large people are saturated by. They're blind to. They've seen so many images of this. And so we worked intercepting two of the busiest and most perilous routes into Europe, beginning in 2014, when there was an exponential rise in incoming refugees and migrants claiming asylum. More than 1 million people landed on the shores of Europe in 2014. And the routes that we chose to intercept were from the east, obviously, from countries such as Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, but also other nations as far away as Bangladesh. These people primarily walked on foot, making their way through Turkey, where they would try to hire human traffickers to bring them on illegal boat crossings across the Aegean Sea to Greek islands. And once they're in Greece, they would claim asylum, or they would attempt to get up the Balkan corridor to make it to Northern Europe. And then the other route that we intercepted was from Africa, obviously. And so countries from as far west as Senegal through Mali, Nigeria, and as far east as the Horn of Africa, Eritrea particularly, Ethiopia, Somalia, and also sub-Saharan nations such as Congo, and car. So a lot of people who are trying to reach Europe through these nations, they would travel through, at the time we were working, and probably now, through the safest country, which is Niger. You have to remember, Sahara Desert is an extremely dangerous place to be. There's a lot of insurgencies, Islamic State in the Maghreb. You have, sorry, that's Al-Qaeda, and in the Maghreb, but also a lot of bandits, a lot of groups. And so it's quite risky. So a lot of people go to a town called Agadez, and then the roads sort of run out on the way to Libya. So what happens is that on a Sunday night, all of the human traffickers have these trucks, and they corral, they sort of drive around, they pick up their paying passengers, and they go en masse in a massive convoy for Libya. And then it's about a 4-day drive, depending. This truck probably took 6 days because it's so big. This is off-road driving, and they go quickly, and they don't stop if you fall off. The IOM say that as many people die in Sahara as die in the Mediterranean. So it's quite a risky journey. And typically that refugees would work for a year or two in Libya to get enough money then to pay a trafficker to put them on a boat. So the camera itself, since it's regarded as a weapon, is export controlled. So it's sanctioned in 12 different nations, including Libya and Syria. And these are two nations, of course, that are key pieces of the puzzle for us as storytellers to tell this story. And so we have to work around those nations and not enter them. Otherwise, we could be arrested for the serious offense of weapon smuggling. So I'll just show a kind of a mashup, a 7-minute clip of the piece to give you an idea. Remember, it's 52 minutes in total. So if you're compelled by it, I would hope that you try and go and see it in a museum installation where the specifics of the installation are very different than something like this. But we'll launch into it anyway.
There's no water coming out. There's no water coming out.
Okay, do more breathings. 5 more breathings. And I will give 10 compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Again. And I give 10 more compressions. 50.
I can hardly get any air in.
Thank you very much. So this last portrait of the young lady, probably a Syrian refugee who just landed on the shores of Lesbos, it's a very tender form of portraiture. Unlike most photography, I've never really seen something like that. And so the camera, because it can zoom in so powerfully, we were able to use it from a sort of medium to short range distance, but then zoom right in to capture these gestures and moments between people, which albeit seem rather invasive. And I'm sure that lady wasn't aware that we were filming her. However, the camera has an anonymizing quality. So the camera, it's impossible to identify the individual because it's a heat trace rather than a depiction of visible light of the world that we see. And this is a very important dilemma, I suppose, that I faced when making the work as a photographer. And I'm sure any photographer working on the refugee crisis issues have faced the same. You have a choice between whether you violate the wishes of refugees, many of whom, for good reason, don't wish to be identified, to tell the story, or do you say, okay, well, actually, I don't have consent from these individuals. Let's not tell the story and look away. So that's a really big question to ask yourself if you're making a story about this. And consent is extremely important when you're dealing with people who are stateless, very vulnerable individuals. They have human rights under international refugee law, but those rights have been massively eroded in the last 10 years, disregarded by our states and our societies. Do you go and ask each one, or do you film the events as they happen? There's not very much time when these things are unfolding to get people to sign off. And so I found that this camera, ironically, given it's a weapons technology, since it anonymizes the individual, it gives me as a storyteller the freedom to tell their story without risking betraying their identity. This is very important, particularly for refugees come to Europe. under something called the Dublin regulation, which is part of EU immigration policy, whereby if officials in, for example, Germany can find documentary evidence of a refugee landing on the shores of, for example, Greece, and that refugee has come all the way to, for example, Berlin and claimed asylum there, they will be, under the Dublin regulation, be sent back to the first port of call, the first country of entry. This is obviously a law invented by Northern European nations to pass the buck to Southern European nations, and it's created, unfortunately, a bottleneck of large numbers of refugees in places like Greece and Italy. And so there's other reasons as well why one would not want to violate the issues of consent. And this is something we constantly considered throughout making the film. The camera itself, it creates this biological, it sort of evokes our processes, our biological processes. It evokes us as an organism, a physical organism. It strips, in a way, us of identity in a very peculiar way. And given its weapons technology, perhaps that's something we need to think about in terms of how our societies regard and represent the refugee. And so, yeah. Anyway, after that, I went to the rainforest, and I made these new images. And this is a surprising move, I guess, but for me it isn't, because I'm working again with ideas of violence, camouflage, and invisible spectrum of light. So I've gone into the rainforest at night using ultraviolet lights, and I'm capturing UV fluorescence in the natural environment. And this is very new work. I haven't actually shown it to anyone yet. And I'm making these images by, as scientists do. It's referencing scientific photography, actually, by doing hyperfocal stacking, which is a method of capturing, say, 100 images of a macro subject such as this, and then stacking them using software. And there's something peculiar about it. But the thing that really compelled me about this work is how evolved, without man's intervention, how evolved nature has become through millions of years of evolution to survive. And there's the jungle, the rainforest, is a place of constant predation, constant killing, and some plants have learned how to eat insects, for example, like this one, so the details. It's almost like a weird science fiction kind of galaxy. There's some strange metallic tints and very unusual portrayal of the natural world, which I've greatly enjoyed making, I must say. I've spent 10 years or more working in rather traumatic places, and it's been very restorative working on this project. And here's a friend and maid, and some extraordinary forms. You can see there, so there's dead pixels in the camera sensor being through the camera software, being turned into a kind of strange effect, these little light wave kind of things. And so I'm beginning a longer project over the next few years, and it will incorporate a film as well. And some of the things I'm wishing to look at are in the rainforest. It's extraordinary. We have in Amazon we have a perfect storm of contributing factors to deforestation. So a lot of deforestation happening in Brazil, for example, is to do with cattle farming. So we have 50 million head of cattle in Brazil. Each requires 1 hectare of land. They also require fodder. And the fodder that they produce for cattle in Brazil is soybean. Soybean is a very unsustainable kind of crop for the land. And so you also have a trade war happening between the United States and China. So China used to import a lot of beef and soy from here. But now they're looking for a new market because they don't want to do that anymore, obviously. So the natural next choice is Brazil, which has high-quality beef and soy. You also have Jair Bolsonaro, the president, who, calling himself Captain Chainsaw, has encouraged farmers, ranchers, vaqueros, they call them, to gut the rainforest and to burn. And so the ranchers, naturally, during the dry season, and here's another contributing factor, is we have longer and longer dry seasons. So normally the rainforest is actually very hard to burn because it's wet. But during the dry season used to be about a month, but now it's 2.5 months. And in that 2.5 months, it's hotter and drier, and we get a tinderbox effect. And so the ranchers who are encouraged to go and burn and basically make new land, make new hectares of land for the cattle, they can do so quite easily. And often, peculiarly, they do so with 10-gallon hats on horseback. The vaquero culture is very much a cowboy culture. And so this is something I'm wishing to look at, as well as the garimperos of southern Venezuela and northern Brazil. There's illegal mining is another massive environmental catastrophe that's unfolding, and sadly, tragically, very underreported because of the risk of traveling in those areas. So the Venezuelan economy is so bankrupt because of the collapse of its petrochemical industry and sanctions that it is actively encouraging illegal gold mining in the Amazon. And so the Venezuelan army is actually working, allegedly, as far as I'm aware, I haven't actually gone down there yet, but I've been researching, in collaboration with armed groups, local armed groups, criminal groups, as well as sometimes Colombian guerrillas on indigenous lands. So the Yanomami tribe and other tribes, uncontacted tribes often, their lands are being, I suppose, scorched and rinsed and turned to desert sometimes, and that especially their water systems are being polluted by mercury, which is a byproduct of the gold mining process. And so these are two aspects of Amazon deforestation that I'm looking forward to trying to represent. And I suppose my strategy here with this new project is to try to find the difficulties in representing environmental catastrophe. And any storyteller who attempts to begin to tell this story is immediately beset by issues of, well, not only cliche, but also scale. I think the scale thing is fascinating because the totality of climate change is so immense that it's way beyond our abilities to perceive it. It's beyond our faculties to comprehend, and it's beyond our perception. And so as artists, as storytellers, it's our job to try to communicate that. And typically, contemporary art would be ideally situated to do so through what Immanuel Kant called the mathematical sublime. And just briefly, I don't want to get too bogged down in the theory of it, but like the mathematical sublime is whereby the imagination cannot perceive the totality of something so great, such as the wilderness. The wilderness is a good go-to for this, because it's way beyond our bodily scale. It's beyond what we can imagine. And so there's a failure, there's a displeasure that occurs. Oh shit, I can't get it. It's too big for me to comprehend. However, then there is the subsequent triumph. It's a two-step process of the supersensible reason. In other words, when we can't imagine the reality that's occurring, our reason takes over, and we can quantitatively understand it through science. And so that is the shock that occurs through the mathematical sublime. However, and that's according to Kant 300 years ago, I'm perceiving at the moment with climate change, with environmental disaster, a failure of reason as well. In spite of the evidence mounting up, many of which has proven true, climate change is already changing the world, yet we're not listening to reason. We've lost the ability to believe in reason at all. So there's a kind of broken sublime. There's a problem not just with the imagination, but also with our sense of science and reason itself. And so there's a new form of blindness surrounding climate change, in my opinion. These are the things that motivate me to make these bizarre pictures. And so, in ending, I'll just show, this is really just a sort of camera test at this point. But I'll just show it to you, I might as well. It's 3 minutes long, and it's merely a kind of a proposal for myself and for my team members. And we hope to spend a couple of years making this new piece. Great, thank you very much.
Excuse me.